Hello again, and welcome to another podcast. Now, in this podcast, I'm going to talk about how you can become more intuitive in your photography, in your visual storytelling. And if you've listened to me before, you know that I talk about visual storyteller, and the purpose of doing that is that by thinking in that way, it gets you to really look at what's in your frame. So we're going to explore that a bit more. Before I dive into it, please remember to give me a like and subscribe, because that helps me to carry on doing these things, which I hope you find useful. So that's really helpful to me. So let's dive into it. Now, I guess what I want to start with, if you've been doing photography for a little while and you've probably heard things like the rule of thirds and maybe some other guidelines, rules that you can apply to your photography to basically make your images more interesting, engage the viewer more, maybe make you feel more inspired when you look at them. Maybe you just feel more pleased with them. All of these things are great, but they're not the end of the story. So you might well have reached a point where you're beginning to feel that you've gone back to where you were before you started using these things. So what I mean by that is just basically to say you are producing images that are sort of the same and not really very inspiring. You're not getting excited by them anymore. And I think one of the great things about photography, and I think this is definitely true early on when we start to use things like rule of thirds, and if you're somebody who's always sticking their subject right in the center of the frame, and then you start experimenting with rule of thirds, suddenly you're creating images that are much more interesting visually. And that can be really exciting. But obviously, if you don't keep new ideas coming in, then that excitement will wear off and you start to produce results that are just the same as the last 50 images you took. And you are looking for a way of changing that. So where I'm going to start with this is, first of all, to look at what the rules are. So rule of thirds is a rule. The mistake that some people make is to think that they have to keep following these rules. And if you've listened to me talk about creative work in photography, one of the things I talk about, and it's generally the last thing if I'm going through steps you can take to improve your photography, whether it's 6 steps or 10 steps, whatever it is, the last one is pretty much always break the rules. Now, the power of rules, again, my opinion, is that it helps you to become consistent. And the importance of consistency in your photography, it means that it basically demonstrates that you've got a good understanding of what your camera is doing. You've got a good understanding of how to compose an image, or at least an acceptable understanding. We can always improve. But essentially, you can keep reproducing the same result. If somebody asked you to go and reproduce in a very similar way a photograph that you've already shot before, but do something same sort of style, you know exactly how you got there. And this is where we start to really know photography as photographers. One of the ways we can demonstrate mastery of any subject is to repeat what we're doing. And if that's not making sense, think about parking a car. If you like parallel parking, if you can just parallel park anywhere and get the same result each time, as in you back into the spot, you don't hit anything, you don't hit the curb, and you finish up with the vehicle nicely spaced between the vehicle behind and in front, that's demonstrating a degree of mastery in parallel parking, as an example. So with photography, it's the same thing. It's a good place to be to reach a point in your photography where you can reproduce more or less the same image in terms of exposure, composition, all that kind of thing. So that demonstrates consistency. Once we have consistency, we can start to experiment with different areas. So it may be composition or trying different composition tools, but this is where we kind of grow our level of mastery, if you like. So you need to be somewhere consistent. And even early on, it doesn't really matter how good you are. If you're really terrible, but you're consistently terrible, you can gradually start to improve different aspects. So this is where rules come in. They give us touch points. They give us points of reference we can use to begin to be consistent, but at a higher level than we were before. So rule of thirds is a great example of that. And for people who, as I've said, tend to stick their subject right in the middle all the time, rule of thirds can be a real breath of fresh air to their images. But if all you do is rule of thirds, that can get pretty boring too after a while. So how do you start to get more creative? Well, the first thing is to understand that there are other rules, that's for sure. And there are other ways of constructing an image. So the Fibonacci series is a good way of doing it. And I talk about all of these in my online course. So we dive into other things you can do. But the important thing is to start to get other ideas where you can expand from what you're already doing. So different ways we can do this. We can look at what other people are doing. It's always good to follow other photographers. I follow quite a few in Instagram, and I get ideas by watching what other people are doing. Sometimes I see an interesting result, and I kind of sort of work backwards to work out how they got that result. And that's another way of perhaps being inspired and challenging your own knowledge, looking at somebody else's work that might have a particular effect or a particular style to it, and just working out how they did it. How did they use lighting? How did they use composition? Have they used rule of thirds? Have they used a different rule? Have they used converging lines? What are they using in there? How have they constructed that image? And sometimes just by looking at somebody else's work and working backwards from that, it can give you ideas. And even if you're just trying one idea, which probably is a good way to go about it initially, because then you can just look at what impact that has and decide whether or not to keep that approach in there. You can start to produce more creative, different work. So the important thing is to really start getting intuitive. And where we get intuitive is just to really play and let our subconscious get involved. Just go with whatever ideas occur to you while you're looking at a subject. Try a different framing. Try a different use of lighting. Shoot into the light more, maybe use backlighting where you would normally have your subject well illuminated. There's so many things you can start to do, but by looking for these different ideas, this is where you start to develop your style and where you can begin to produce different work. And the key thing about it is once you start with one idea, often that will prompt you to try something else and then something else again. And then all of a sudden you're beginning to produce work that is completely different to what you did before, or at the very least is starting to inspire you again. So one of the key takeaways from this is to remember that rules are there to just give you some guidance, give you a reference point, but they're absolutely there to be broken. So I guess one thing to think about, are there rules that you're currently sticking with that you're finding they're stifling your creativity, or you're getting a bit frustrated with them? If that's the case, then my suggestion is just drop that rule. Don't use it again for a while. Try challenging yourself to do something different. There are other things you can do if this all sounds a bit of a stretch for you, and you're thinking, well, you're not a creative person, you just want to take nice photographs. So start thinking of other things you can do. So some very simple things are to limit yourself to one lens. So you might only have one lens, so that might not be a problem. Hopefully it's a zoom lens. What you can do is just lock it off at one focal point. If it's say a 70 to 210, sit it at 150, or even sit it at 70, and lock it there, and don't allow yourself to use the zoom. So now what you've got to do is you've got to start to look at that image. You've got to look at what's in the viewfinder and think visual storyteller, but where you might normally zoom in to get a particular story or a particular image, how do you now tell that same story, or maybe a different one, but just using that 70 mil focal length rather than 200? So these are the kind of places and the kind of exercises you can do to challenge yourself. And the beauty of this is it does make you look again at what you're shooting. It stops you from just going to your go-to setup, which is probably why you're getting a bit frustrated in the first place, because you're producing the same results because you're doing the same thing every time. So do something different. One of the most important things you can work with is light and shadow. So I think it's really important to try different lighting when you can. And if you can't change lighting, if you're photographing buildings, for example, can you change your position so that the way you're approaching the light is different? Can you shoot the same subject where you're shooting into shadow, so you might be burning out the background, or alternatively you might expose for the background, so you've now got pretty much a silhouette? What difference does that make? One of the things I love to do with animals actually is, if I'm in the right spot, and it often doesn't happen because you can't, with wild animals, it's difficult to control where you can't control where they are, in essence. You control where you are to a point, but you can't always jump off and head off wherever. You might need to stay on particular routes or whatever it is. But I love to experiment with backlighting, because what it does, it tends to bring out the edges of an animal, generally fur and hair that you don't normally see. And it just gives a different effect. Sometimes you can almost get a kind of halo effect around the body, and it's just the way the light is picking up fur on the animal. So backlighting is a favorite. Try getting in close, maybe with something that's backlit. What's in my mind is vegetation, so it might be leaves, something like that. What can you do that create a different effect? And the story in that sense might be just to give a different aspect of the animal, and it's to present maybe an everyday object in a way that people don't normally see it. So they look at it again. And when we do, with everyday things, we tend to look, but we don't see. And I think one of the best things you can do if you don't have access to animals and all this kind of thing is to go to places that everybody goes. And here I'm thinking of Circular Quay in Sydney, actually, because I was shown, in fact, by Shane Rosario, who was on a podcast a little while ago now. But there's a lot of detail there in the railings and things like that, little dolphins that thousands of people walk past every day, and they probably are not aware that they're even there. So this is the power of just starting to look at things differently. And by challenging yourself, you start to see things that you would normally have walked past, and you can tell that story. You can share that little detail, and perhaps people who walk past it every day have never even seen it. So there's lots of ways of tapping into that creativity, getting those new ideas. And it really is a case of taking a good look at what's there, thinking about the elements of what you do. So, what are the elements of every shot? Lighting, composition, focal length, shutter speed, all those kind of things. So maybe you can freeze action with a fast shutter speed, or maybe you want to use a very slow shutter speed and get a different perspective of an area where things are moving. It might even be trees moving in a breeze, but if you shoot at a low shutter speed, you get a different feel to that image. So there's lots and lots of ways that you can experiment and start to tell stories, everyday stories, in a different way. So think about the framing, how things framed, and work with different compositions. Think about emotional impact, perhaps, over geometric arrangements. So the rule of thirds is essentially geometry. But what happens if you completely break away from that? What if you put your subject down in one corner or over to hard one side of the frame? What does all of that use of space do to the feel of that image? What's going on with that person when they're right up against one edge of the frame? If it's a person, if it's an animal, what's going on? What's going on if you put a lot of space behind? This is the power of using space in an image to tell stories. And the beauty of storytelling is that we don't actually have to tell everyone the whole story, because we are natural storytellers. If you think about it, how popular is Hollywood, television, all that kind of thing today. But if you go back a couple of hundred years, people reading books. If you go back even further, you can think of people sat around a campfire telling each other stories. We love stories. And if there isn't an obvious story there with an image, often what people will do is just make their own story up. And this is where we get to stage 4 of that 4-stage photography process I mentioned. So stage 1 is imagining the image. Stage 2 is actually capturing it. So that's the bit we do with the camera. Stage 3 is the post-processing. So we might be changing contrast. We might be changing the intensity of color or removing color. We might be reframing it. But we're doing work in that post-shooting aspect. And then the fourth part is where we put it out there. We put it on Instagram or Facebook, or print it and stick it on a wall, or put it in a gallery. But people who then look at it are looking at that image through the lens of their own life. And they are quite likely to see things that we haven't, because we're not that person. We haven't lived their life. We don't know how they're reinterpreting what we've shot. And this is where it becomes art. This is where it becomes subjective. And this is the bit we have no control over. So by using things like space, different compositions, we create room for that person who's viewing that image to fill in the gaps, to make up their own story, but we're pointing them in certain directions. This is one of the fun things when you start getting into this sort of intuitive, creative aspect of photography, is you can start to set a framework up for people to build their own stories, but you don't actually know what that story is likely to be. So remember that when you're creating these images, yes, you need to have ideas. I think of it as ideas in my back pocket when I'm going off to photograph wildlife, because I might have to come up with something pretty quickly because the situation's presented itself and I've got to be able to react to that pretty quickly. And that gives us that second part, the actual acquisition. But when it comes to the editing, remember, there's a lot you can do there. And sometimes, again, when I'm editing images, and maybe I've done a few and I'm getting a bit bored with that, but I've got to come up with something. I might just flip them into black and white and play with the contrast, because the beauty of going to black and white, for example, is that we see things in color. So when we're looking at something in color, we're looking at it in the way that we're used to seeing things. And what our brains do, because our brains really don't like working too hard, if they can possibly avoid it, it will tend to take shortcuts. So when we see things in color and we see things in the way we would normally see them, so for example, if we took a photograph just standing and took it at normal eye level, that's how we're used to seeing things, because mostly that's how we walk about. We're, upright and at eye level, at least most of us. So when you go to black and white, suddenly we're not seeing that scene in the way that we would normally see it. We're seeing it differently because black and white emphasizes texture, it emphasizes shapes, and that's what we start picking up on. So all of a sudden, you've got an image that can feel quite differently when it's in black and white. And obviously by working with different aspects of geometry and spacing and all of that, we can begin to produce images that are quite compelling. And that's, in a way, the secret of a good image. And something I like to share, and I have done before, is the best definition I heard of what makes a good photograph. And that's one that the viewer will spend a lot of time looking at. So they're looking at it through the lens of their life. And we might even be wondering what they're seeing there. But that if you've got an image with good composition and an interesting, unusual take on a scene, that can create a very compelling image. And it could be an image of something that is very everyday. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. I hope there's been some useful ideas in this. It's been a bit more of I don't want to say ramble. It's more of a kind of loose podcast to what I would normally do. But I think once we start getting into creativity, and particularly when we have those creative blocks, it's sometimes good to just step back and kick around different ideas. So I hope you found that this podcast is more that kind of a thing. So just to recap, if you've started using rule of thirds or been using it a while and you're just finding you're getting frustrated again with your images, and that's why you started using rule of thirds in the first place, because you weren't very happy with what you were producing, but you've introduced all of these rules and now you're still not happy. Think about doing things differently. So create limitations. I did a podcast recently about how limiting yourself can really inspire your creativity. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but doing things like limiting yourself to one focal length when you shoot, it makes you rethink how you're going to tell that story. Think about how you're composing. Look at other composition rules. There's a lot in my online course about composition. There's lots and lots you can do there. Be inspired by other people. Go back to the basics. Look at lighting. Look at how you're framing. Look at how you're using space. Look at how you're using color. There's a lot of things in there that you can do. So if you have reached a point where you are feeling a little bit creatively exhausted, just step back and maybe limit yourself. It's a great way to get the sort of creative process going again. And what happens is you raise your level of consistency. So I spoke about that has been really important. And hopefully you'll re-inspire yourself again. And I think as a note to leave on, that's a great thing for photography to be able to deliver to us as photographers. But we're people and we want to be inspired by what we're doing. So when we challenge ourselves creatively, when we recognize we've hit a creative block, to go off and do something to just try and break that is a really powerful thing to do. And I think it makes us better photographers in the end. Okay, so I hope you found that useful. I will be back again in the next podcast where we'll be talking about something different. But do please remember what I mentioned at the beginning. If you would like me to do more of a deep dive on perhaps composition or some other subject, just let me know. And also, as just a heads up, the mini workshops will be making a return. I'm planning a short series of those. Again, any thoughts you've got on that? What would you like as a mini workshop? So this will be something that maybe only runs for an hour and a half, but we will be going into a subject where you'll be able to work through different ideas. So what would you like to have help with? Just let me know. Share any thoughts, ideas in the comments, or write to me at graham@ge.photography. And I'll speak to you again next time. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.